What is up? Wanted to just do a fun little video today to show you something that I think is going to end up coming off as being very unexpected. So the backstory here is I used to be a well-known web designer. That's sort of how I got my start in all web stuff, building websites, that kind of thing. And, my tool of choice back then was to use Photoshop. And I would create a mock-up of the site that I thought I was going to build, or a design I wanted to build. And I would do all that stuff in Photoshop. And, it was a very intense process. And then my job would be to, kind of take what I drew on the marker board there, so to speak, and then translate it into an actual website, with code and things like that. But again, Photoshop was my tool of choice. I did a whole lot of image production. I created little graphics to use in the design, icons, little images, little bedazzles, things like that. I did all that stuff in Photoshop. And then, ever since then, I've pretty much been using Photoshop to create images, or at least from 2005 to 2012, I used, Photoshop to do all that image production. And there's other tools too, like GIMP is a free one you can, download and install on any operating system. There's some web-based tools, like befunky.com, I think is one of them. There's a few. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so those are Photoshop-like tools that you can use to create images with, some limited functionality there. But around 2013, actually in the summer of 2013, I stopped using Photoshop to create images. There's a couple reasons it stopped working on my Mac, because the operating system kept updating and rendering that thing useless, rendering the software useless. And then on top of that, I never liked Photoshop renders text poorly. I don't know if I can get a good example of this. We'll look at one. We'll attempt to look for one here. We'll see if I can sort of show you how Photoshop does a bad job with text. Anyway, if you know me, I love text, I love fonts, I love crisp text production. And Photoshop is not real good at that. So here's an old image, but you can kind of tell that text is a little bit pixelated and it's just not super, super clean. And so that fuzziness around letters is known as anti-aliasing. And this has been a concept in producing digital text forever. And in my opinion, Macs have, Macintosh computers have always had a very crisp and clear production of text. Like I think this text here, this looks beautiful. It's very crisp. It's just perfect. But in contrast, Windows machines have always seemed a little bit more pixely. I don't think the anti-aliasing is quite as smooth, and the final presentation is not as polished seeming to me. Now I think I'm really splitting hairs here, but the deal is, so for years I've dealt with that contrast between what the Mac presents, or what it produces here in terms of text, and then when I would go to Photoshop, the text would not be nearly as crisp, and so that created a mismatch. You've got this crisp text, and then you've got this weird fuzziness from anti-aliasing over in the image. Now, before anyone wants to get smart, yes, Photoshop has always had like 5 or 6 different types of anti-aliasing modes that you could employ. They all look like crap. That's the reason I'm doing this video and saying all this stuff, and why I've chosen to take the path I've chosen is because all that stuff is inadequate. That may have changed now. I don't care. The reason I don't care is because Adobe wanted $600 a year for a Photoshop license. I'm just not doing that. Now, I realize they've changed the terms and everything now, but the thing is, since 2013, since I changed what I do and what I'm going to show you in this video, since I changed the way I work, I just no longer really have a need for Photoshop. Okay? And so what am I using instead? Well, I might be the only guy on the planet doing this, but I just use Thesis, my software, and I create images in the browser. Just like I'm creating a website, I create images that way. So I'm going to show you how I do this. All right? So first we're going to look at some of these images. So these are open graph images, and I've got another video on using open graph tags on your website to enhance the way your site looks in social media feeds, enhance the way links to your sites look in social media feeds. And as part of that, you get this big image, which we're looking at here. It's called an open graph image. So I create my open graph images. Now, obviously, these are not mind-blowing images, but I had specific requirements for the width and the height of the image. And then I get to play around with the text that's in it. I've added some branding, and I've got stuff positioned in various places. Oh, look at this. So again, we've got the same width and height. This is another Open Graph image. And then I've got this little design thing I made here to kind of add visual interest to this particular Open Graph screenshot. And what you have to imagine is that it's been cut out along the lines of the rectangle. That's how I finish the image before it's in production, or once it actually goes into production. But I wanted to kind of show you some of these images I make. So these are all Open Graph ones. This is a different one. This is a little banner that I use on the DIY Themes website. Let's see, these are Open Graph ones. I used to make these things, these screenshots for skins for a thesis. I used to make these things with the browser. I made all these in the browser. Every one of these, even this one, which is pretty cool, I think. So, I mean, obviously these are not like the craziest images you've ever seen. I mean, this one's pretty intense, huh? So there's really no limits. It's just you just have to know what you are working with, to be able to get a good outcome. But so we'll flip over. I've got this other skin. Now this is a nothing skin. Any of you out there with a thesis installation on WordPress could create a skin, an empty skin, which is what this one started off as, and use this to produce graphics. That's what I've done. So we're gonna flip over to that. We'll flip to the skin editor, and you can see. So the home template is just the one that renders on this particular page, and I've got all of this stuff that I have made with, with just CSS and HTML, which is crazy, right? We think about, gotta have Photoshop or these kinds of tools. Well, you can do all the stuff that Photoshop does with, some exceptions in terms of very advanced filtering, stuff like that, like crazy stuff. A photographer is not going to want to do this to finish his images, but someone who needs to produce graphics for use on the internet, this is a pretty good option. It's cheap, and it's obviously super sustainable. It just works. It just works. So anyway, I set up my HTML, which is pretty simple. So like for one of these Open Graph things, I have a container. It's like a div. If any of you know HTML, just a basic div, and then I've got another div inside it that holds the text. And I actually wrap like the titles in a span tag, the DIY Themes logos in a span tag, and so is the URL reference. So we'll look at that. So here's this is the very top one, this one here. So I've got my wrapper. I've given it a couple classes that are special, endemic to what I've done here. And then in the text box, I've just got, some HTML markup with class references, because that's how I'm going to eventually style, the components that show up here. But what's cool about this, what is almost sort of better than Photoshop, where some additional leverage comes from, is this idea that you can create stuff and reuse them. It's almost like templates for your images. It's really cool. So a little thing, a motif that shows up again and again here is the DIY Themes branding down in the corner. I only had to set this up one time. I set up the Open Graph class here one time. I'll show it to you. So it's OG class. That means it's going to be an Open Graph image. OG DIY, that adds the additional layer of DIY Themes website branding, which is the red color. Okay, that's the red color. And it's also the font that's used here. This is called Sentinel. This is my headline branding font all over DIYthemes.com. So I use that here. And we can go over and look at the CSS, and we can see that OG sets up that box. And there's a text box inside it. That's the inner div I spoke about. So the outer div that makes the big red box is OG. And the inner one is actually just generic text box, which is a modular component within Thesis. And I set all this stuff up. Now it probably looks a little crazy. The code might look a little crazy if you're not super familiar with CSS. But the bottom line is I had to go through the process of setting this up one time. And here's the branding. So this branding section says, okay, output, these special fonts, then with the logo type, and then also the URL, and position it down here in the corner. all that stuff is defined one time. Like I said, I did this one time, and then every screenshot I deploy with OG is going to be able to stick the DIY themes branding in the lower right corner, just automatically. And then if you add OG DIY, which is right here, then that does the additional step of making the background color red and the text white. And then, like I said, it also applies the Sentinel font with the associated sizing you see here. And then the branding is just a little bit different. There's just one little tweak to make it look perfect, but it doesn't matter. Bottom line is now I have these patternized things. I can roll these out super quickly. To make a new Open Graph screenshot like this, I'll do it real quick. So we'll mimic the structure. So we'll say we'll deploy an HTML container. We will rename it. We'll say OG example image. Whoops. And we're going to go to the class. We're going to apply OG and OG DIY. Going to drag that over here. We're going to deploy a text box, which is going to be just off your screen, but it's at the bottom of the selection list here. And we will call it text box sample image, and we do not need to apply anything there. And I'm not going to add the HTML yet. I'm going to go copy this HTML, which is what I do when I'm creating a new image. I'm just copying it. I'm going to paste it in here. And then I would change the title. We're going to save it. Now we're going to flip over here, hold shift, click refresh, boom. I just created a new Open Graph image just by deploying that pattern, that template that I had already created for my Open Graph images. I've got 3 different types on here. So here's this. So this is just a generic DIY themes one with my branding colors. This is a focus specific. So if we look over here, we can see that the focus screenshot sort of got this concentric circle thing going on. I pulled from that motif in this screenshot. I stuck it over in the lower right corner because that makes the text easier to read and doesn't really interfere with it, but still kind of has that cool look thing going on. And then I've got, so this is a focus specific screenshot. I would use this on the DIY Themes website on a page that has content specific to the focus WordPress theme. And then I've got this other one. This is for the Focus Ethos Masterclass. I made that purple just so it would really stand out in social media feeds and is a little bit different than the rest of my site. And then I've got this one, which is intended to be used in the documentation, the old thesis documentation portion of the DIY Themes website. So there's 4 different styles of Open Graph images, templates, I guess, that I've already created that I can deploy as quickly as what I just showed you, which is just totally cool. It's just a different way to do it. Now, I'm going to go through the last step here just to bring this all home for you guys. And we will cut this image. I'll show you what I do. This is probably the biggest pain in the butt part of the process because it's not exact. But the eventual outcome is going to be exact, but the process here is imprecise. So what I do is I use Command, Shift, and 4 on my Mac to create a screenshot area, and I'm going to create a little rectangle that's just bigger that encompasses the whole thing. So there it is. So now I've got a screenshot, and now I take this screenshot over to iloveimg.com, and I go to the crop tool. And I'm going to drag my image over here. Okay. The dimensions that I use here, the dimensions of this actual image in the browser are 960 by 502. I am working on a Retina screen which has twice the pixel density of whatever standard is. I mean, this is kind of a fluid thing, but just go with me here. So it's twice the pixel density. So when I cut that image that I just did with that little rectangular snip tool, it actually cuts an image that's twice as big as what I want. The image itself, the resulting image I want is not going to be 960 by 502. It's going to be 1920 by 1004. And you can see that it expanded the little rectangular box here. And then so now it's going to be the right size, and then now we have to adjust the position X and position Y to try and get this thing exactly around the red portion and not any of the white. And so I'm going to move my X back a little bit. Okay, I'll move the X to 5, and we'll move the Y position to 7. We'll try that. We'll see if that works. That might be one off. We'll try 6. So I'm going to hit crop. And then I'm going to click this button to compress the image. This just makes it, it optimizes the image file size wise. It makes it really small, as small as it can be. And that's what we want to do whenever we are going to upload an image for use on the internet. We want to make sure it is optimized. Every image should be compressed in the manner I've shown you here. All right, so let's look in the Finder and let's see if this image is going to work. Okay, this is huge. Maybe I can step this down for everybody. Okay, if we look at this, we can see that this image is not correct because the x-axis has a white line on the right. So I need to back the x off 1. The y was perfect. There is no white space above or below. So we will ditch the images that I have the image I created so far, and we're going to go back to the cropper. Going to reload that image. We're going to go 1920 by 1004, and we're going to go 5 and 6. Is that right? No, we're going to go 4 because we need to back the x off 1. So 4 and 6, we will crop, and then we will compress, and we will download that thing, and then we will do our sanity test here. Let's check it out again. Dun, dun, dun. And one more. All right, we got no white space. This is looking super good. And so now I can take this image, rename it something that is useful instead of screenshot 2020-04-22 at 2:42:29 p.m. .png, because that's not very descriptive. And then that image will be ready for me to upload into my WordPress media gallery and then specify it as an open graph image, or I could use it in some other context, such as just an image in my blog post. Okay? And so here's what I love about this approach. There's actually a lot to unpack here. But what's cool about this is, number one, you get pattern leverage if you are creating images that are going to be the same size. I just showed you the pattern leverage I use with the Open Graph stuff to create this style, the focus style, the DIY theme style, the focus ethos style, the documentation style. So that's pattern leverage right there. What's so cool about this is you should always be operating with patterns for all your images. If it's a hero image, well, you need a standard size for your hero images. If it's going to be used in your blog post, okay, what you really want to do is have an image that's about 39%. Takes up about 39% of the width of the column. Okay, that might seem like a funky number, but that's actually a goal that sets up. If you use an image, okay, so this is another pro tip here. You want to use an image on the right-hand side of your content at the start of the content because it constrains the width of the text in the first paragraph. Visitors like this because this line of text, which is very narrow, looks easy to read. This doesn't look like a drag. It looks like, hey, I can read this and go ahead and get started. Maybe this content will be delightful. But if all you see is a big wall of text, it's not looking quite as good. This looks like a bigger challenge to read. It looks like a little bit more of a drag. And so people are going to do it less. So this is a little trick you can employ to get people engaged with your content before they even really have a chance to think about it. And the reason you want it to be 39% is because that sets up a golden ratio of text to image, and that's really pleasing. Like, that's known to be an inviting and pleasing proportion. Humans like this, and so you could just play to this sort of subconscious programming that we're all running by making an image that's 39% of your content width. So how do we do that? Well, we can, if we're using Chrome, we can right-click on just a piece of text in there, go to Inspect, and then we can see how wide is our text. So this paragraph is 688 pixels wide. That means my column of text is 688 pixels wide. So we could say 688 times 0.39 and that's going to be 268 pixels wide. So if I had inclinations of making a little introductory pinch image, I would set up a class I would set up my little environment here and set up a little class that does, a 39% image, give it some name like golden ratio post image or something like that. And it would be 200 and whatever we said, 268 pixels wide. And then I'd probably set it up so I could adjust the heights to accommodate whatever I want to stick in that image. But it's an interesting practice to do that. So I would set up my pattern, and then I would just have a pattern for all of my squeeze images like this, and I could then use that from then on out. So I'd have a pattern for that. Have a pattern for your open graph images. Those need to be a certain size. All of those things. So all the imagery that you're going to be using on your website or like in this way, you definitely want to be patternized as much as possible. And because of that, this approach to using CSS and HTML to create images ends up being a really good one. And the ultimate benefit, to go back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is that the text is so crisp and perfect. It is going to look so good. It's going to look so good everywhere. And that's the ultimate for me. It's like I've been waiting 12 years to be able to create images with perfectly crisp text that matches what I get in the browser, which I just love. So there it is. Crazy internet guy, of course, has a crazy solution to creating imagery now that I no longer feel like paying for Photoshop and dealing with all that stuff all the time. And I actually like this better because there's not a degree of separation between this and the final outcome. It's not like I have to create a design in Photoshop and then translate it into HTML to be used later. Like I skip that step. I just work in HTML. I'm an artist. HTML and CSS is my medium. I can do anything with it. And this is not something that's special to me or unique to me. Anyone with any sort of knowledge of CSS at all can employ this same approach to creating images. And it just works. It's great. And I think that Thesis makes this super easy because you can easily deploy stuff within templates. Like I showed you how quick and easy it was for me to set up that little HTML environment. And then flip over to the CSS tab here, and I can create all my styles. And then I can just rapidly check on them, make changes, save, go check on the result, and tweak my images to get exactly the outcomes I want. So anyway, there it is. I think that's sort of delightful and certainly unexpected because we just assume that everyone uses Photoshop. Maybe not though. Maybe not. Maybe there's some crazy people out there like me who are doing this sort of approach and still getting really good results. All right. Thanks for watching. I'll have another video for you soon. Take care.